identify it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to mark that as editor ready, and we'll wordsmith and figure out the implications as we go along, I think. So the network's down. Something. Oh, really? Okay. Idempotency. And so assuming, I mean, we do have a number of open issues here, so there's going to be a substantial stream of changes to this document. But we haven't had new issues raised on this document for some time. I know that we have some implementation. Yes, Scribe. Which document? Alternative services. Yeah. My intention then is that we should get these issues actually reflected in the draft, close them out, issue a new revision, give the working group something on the order of a week to have a good look at it, and then do a working group last call. Maybe even less than a week, since it's just working group rather than IETF last call. Unless I hear folks saying, oh, I still need to think about this, or I'd like more time to play with the implementation aspects of this. And I'm looking at Patrick, because Patrick's been deeper in the implementation of this than many others.
Right. So just for people who want to play with an implementation, you can take right now Firefox 37, which is the beta channel, and that will go to release in 2 weeks. And that actually implements 04 of alternative services, but that is consistent for including the indications in as the header name as opposed to the frame option. That's actually consistent between the current draft and 04 for most intensive purposes. So you can try that out, with your servers. It will support both H2 and Speedy, but it won't do H1 because we've talked about the lack of scheme indication.
Yes.
In H1. So that gives you a chance to play with something, and we'll be releasing that in a couple weeks.
Okay, but
1 week.
But so then that explicitly doesn't do the invalidation scoping stuff we recently decided, correct?
Right.
Okay. Will that be relatively soon afterwards, do you think? Let's publish. Publish. Okay. Any other? Yes.
Can we turn the mic up?
If someone knows where the board is. Where's the board? Is it behind the screen? Back. This one? Can someone at the back turn it up and make us all go ouch when it gets too loud? Is the board back there? And forevermore he was known. Is that better? We still haven't gotten our battery. Okay, we'll assume that that'll fix itself. So that's alternative services. The next draft is something that uses alternative services to a particular effect, which is opportunistic security. This draft is targeted to be experimental. After a lot of discussion, we thought that would be the most appropriate status for it. And if I remember correctly, all we have left on this is an editorial issue to do a little bit of alignment in concept and language between this and the alt services draft. So there'll be probably one more version of this to make sure that all the concepts are properly aligned, and then we'll do just as we talked about with alternative services. It'll probably go to last call at the same time. Do something like a 2-week working group last call. Oh, that is. I feel I have a lot more vocal presence now. Thank you. So same story here. Last we checked, Mozilla was implementing opportunistic security. Still correct, I assume. I know that Akamai was interested in implementation from the server side. As far as I'm aware, the other browsers haven't changed their mind in terms of their stance towards this spec. But we'll see how that goes as well. I know that the security area folks are especially keen to get this published to see how it works out in the real world. Any other comments, issues, thoughts about opportunistic security?
So that's the same schedule.
I think it's the same. I think we'll lock them together, yeah.
No, and for our deployment.
And for your deployment. Oh, okay, good. So people can, I know I did a demo page a long time ago for OPSEC to show that it worked on my home page. I've since gone HTTPS only, so that doesn't work anymore. Oops. But I can set up another host, I guess. You know. You're crazy.mnot.net, sure. Okay, so that's it for OPSEC as well. I think we can expect a new draft and then a working group last call shortly thereafter, which is good. Tunnel protocol. So this draft, to remind folks, is to allow a client to inform a proxy that it is explicitly connecting to and issuing an HTTP connect, so creating a tunnel to that proxy, through that proxy. It can inform the proxy of what it's going to do inside of that tunnel. So it could be for, I think the canonical use case was for WebRTC, so that RTC could inform the proxy, hey, I'm going to be doing video conferencing over this. If that's not cool by you, or you want to treat me different for quality of service or what have you, that's something you can do. And there's been a lot of discussion, and bummer, there aren't any issues open. So I think we're in a state where, again, we can go to working group last call on this. Again, any discussion, any issues that people have before we do that?
I guess in the interest of transparency, there is a pull request on this one open.
There is.
Go to the pull request.
Oh, right. This is the one that just came up.
I had some private feedback that there wasn't as much context in the sort of introductory material as some people might like. So I provided some of that. And I also added this to note that this is not a security mechanism in any way.
Sure.
None of the claims that a client is making in the request can actually be verified necessarily.
Yeah.
Now, in the current version of TLS, you can actually simply snoop the TLS and see what's going on there, but there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case in TLS 1.3 or later on. Sure. Once we start to move to more encryption, you're going to see that ability disappear. And so people can lie, and you're going to have to deal with that.
Right.
I also had some private feedback offline that someone was unhappy about the fact that this was optional. And my response to that is very simple. It doesn't happen at all today.
Right.
And so you're not going to be able to distinguish between someone who has an old client and someone else. We do have the option in WebRTC of actually mandating its use.
Right.
And we probably will. That is a situation where people running their WebRTC apps in the browser don't really have any control over this header field. We're just going to force it upon them, and that means that people in the enterprise scenarios will actually have the luxury of knowing that if you deploy a browser that does WebRTC, it will actually be telling the proxy that it's doing WebRTC every time it does so. And I think that's a pretty useful property to have.
Right. And yeah, I mean, that's just the nature of HTTP extensibility. We can't make a new header mandatory. It doesn't work that way as a protocol. But RTC certainly can make it mandatory that when you're using RTC, you have to send that header. And I think that was, I remember the discussions we had. I forget which meeting it was, but when we started this work, that was always the case. It's just been that hasn't been clear to everyone as we've gone along.
And there were concerns from people that including the header field was potentially leaking information about what was going on in the channel, and you might want the option to simply not send it under certain situations where you did want to hide what was going on in there, even though you might, in some cases, actually prefer the different traffic prioritization or whatever things you wanted to just hide what you're doing. So you would just.
So that's a decision for RTC to make when they decide what language to use around the use of this header. Yeah.
And I expect to have that discussion hopefully when this is published.
Sure.
Because that's how they operate.
And personally, I think this text is fine because through this process, I've noticed a few people have gotten confused about, it's like, oh, but you can't trust it. Well, of course you can't trust it. That's the nature of the thing. But making that explicit is nice because people won't get tripped on that quite as much, maybe, if they bother to read this text. Ecker, did you have a... Okay. So is everyone happy to have this text added? It seems like just a clarification. I'm tempted to say this is nearly editorial. Anyone uncomfortable with that? Okay.
Raise the comment. Have we done last call?
No.
Then let's have a last call.
Yeah. So go ahead and put the text in. Go ahead and publish a new draft. We'll initiate last call. For simplicity's sake, we might do all three documents at the same time, assuming we don't have a great editorial lag on alt services. That's the one that does need some work.
You can do the last call on this one right now.
Yeah, probably, I'd say.
Actually, I guess I do have one minor comment. I think this is generally correct, but if you look at all the work by Peranti and people like that on traffic identification, by packet analysis, like my point is that the implied claim here is you can't trust the tunnel protocol, but you don't want to turn this into accidentally a claim that you can't do traffic analysis to figure out what's going on.
Yes.
So this
Yes.
might need a little wordsmithing to get that proper, but I'll be happy to help. I know, but I'm not actually sure. I think Alfredo's point would be it's neither difficult or impossible, like you would do.
Right. Yeah.
I'll think about it at all. But I think generally this is a fine sentiment.
Okay. Good.
Also, it makes it very difficult.
Right. Okay, anything else on tunnel protocol? It sounds like we're going to be in last call on that very, very soon. And again, I expect that to just be a 2-week last call. Okay. So, potential work. Like I said, it looks like we're going to last call on all of the documents we currently have in process. And I've been talking to Barry, our area director, about the future of the working group. We don't want to keep the working group open just to keep the working group open. If we have reasonable things for the working group to be doing, I think that's a fine thing. And I think, for me, one of the nice things is we've built the HTTP community back into something where there's regular meetings of implementers and knowledge transfer there, and that's a good thing to have the community in place. But at the same time, we don't want to give the working group busy work. So we've been tracking for a little while now items of potential work that we might want to think about in the future on the wiki page here. And what I want to do is go through this briefly and get a sense of what people think about these different things. I suspect that there are maybe on the order of 3 or 4 of these that might be interesting for the working group to dive into. I don't think that any of them are particularly substantial, but I wanted to get that feedback. I don't know, we're certainly not going to make decisions today, but I'd like the input of folks who are here so we can figure out what, if anything, we're going to do in the next little bit in this working group. So let's run through them real quick. HTTP signatures. Oh, thank you, tools.ietf.org. Come on, you can do it. Yes. This is a spec for signing HTTP messages. It's interesting in that Manu has spent a lot of time polishing this, and he worked with Joyent on the original spec, but it's forming part of the web payments work in the W3C. And so it's interesting from that aspect. I haven't seen much interest in it outside of that area, so I think it's probably a little early for us to adopt right now. But I'm happy to be proven wrong on that if folks have strong feelings about it. Okay. And I'm looking especially for, I've tried to identify who the relevant stakeholders are for each of these specs. I'm looking, if you're one of these, parties or another interested party in these and you'd like to see work in this area, please say so. So my gut feeling on that one is we probably won't adopt that anytime soon unless we see a significant change in demand for it. HTTP client hints is potentially interesting, and I have heard some folks, especially browser folks, express interest in this spec. This is Ilya Grigorik from Google, who's very often focused on performance, web performance. Basically, allowing a client to describe things in requests that can be used to select a response representation. So, for example, the device pixel ratio of the browser currently, so you can send an appropriate density image back if you're using Retina displays, for example, or the screen size that the browser currently has, so you can send an appropriate layout. And there's a fair amount of interest in this in the web performance community that I've seen. So this is potentially interesting for folks to think about if you've looked at this. If you haven't looked at this, I would suggest you look at it sometime soon, because it's really about the interaction between, it's content negotiation. It's basically new hints for content negotiation. Larry.
So about 10 years ago, there was work in this area with media features. It wasn't implemented widely, but there's already existing RFCs that have a vocabulary and a registry of parameters and analyzing that, and even a way of combining a bunch with the signature for previous recognition. So if
that
it's
was
not referenced in here, it should be.
Right. I agree. It should be, and it should be evaluated against that work. I think that was more for fax, wasn't it? Or at least that was the genesis of it.
I worked on it, and we designed it for HTTP as well.
Okay.
Eric Pasquarella. It's probably obvious, but one of the distinctions people have been trying to draw for client-side fingerprinting has been between active and passive fingerprinting, with the distinction being that passive is things that the client just sends unsolicited to the server all the time, and active is things that require executing JavaScript on the client. So the more crap the client puts in these messages unsolicited, the bigger the fingerprinting surface. And there certainly have been, I've heard the uneasy compromise that's been achieved between the security people who think that this is hopeless and the privacy people who think it's important has been that that we'll attempt to minimize the passive fingerprinting surface and not worry very much about the active fingerprinting surface.
Right.
So this represents potentially a border incursion in that little struggle.
Okay. That I have not heard that on this particular spec before, so that's interesting. We should feed that back to Ilya at a minimum. Any other interest in this spec? I see sort of from a few people. I see yes from some people.
So I have definite interest, maybe not commitment, but interest. Going forward, it is controversial even within my community. As a lot of this stuff can be expressed at a web level, but not every client is a browser, and there are some things you're going to be able to do better at the protocol level. One of the interesting things is, it's not like you require an IETF importeur in order to mint a header and to start using it. And so if we don't take on this work, it may happen independently of places where we could provide a more comprehensive sort of privacy and security review of going forward. And so it might be an interesting thing to engage with rather than just step back and see what happens. That'd be my inclination.
Okay.
Chris Bensel, Google. I guess since Ilya is already represented, it might be obvious, but we're interested in this in general. You can also imagine it extending to other properties as well for images. You can imagine having some amount of network characteristics. Again, we're running into the passive fingerprinting issue, so there's a trade-off. But if you have like a TCP proxy in the network in between you can't just use the round trip time for the TCP handshake to sort of understand what the performance is. And especially in emerging markets or places where there's bad performance, this would be an easy way without rewriting your web page to get dynamic image content. And there's definitely a lot of other proposals that are going on, but we're interested in this in general.
Okay.
Peter Grice, Facebook. We're interested in this for the same set of reasons, and in fact, we already do stuff like this ourselves, just with either cookies or headers. I guess I can't speak for other teams within Facebook that do that specific thing, but I can imagine they would be very interested in adopting this if it's a standard, particularly for our mobile website where we don't control the client. Regarding network characteristics, I think we're also interested in that as well, although it's a little bit harder to estimate that from the client since you aren't the sender, you're just the receiver, so you don't really see everything that's going on. But to the extent that that type of stuff can be standardized, we're very interested in kind of playing around with that as well.
Okay.
Darshak Thakur, Cable Labs. So we have also been participating in the MPEG Dash, and I know there's a Dash presentation coming along, but this is one of the things that might be useful in some of the work that Dash was trying to do in terms of providing client hints or something. So I think that will also be useful from that point of view.
Good. So I'm hearing a number of people expressing interests to various degrees, some of it fairly strong, a little bit of concern about the privacy characteristics. I think Patrick's point is well taken, that if this is going to happen in some way, having it happen in a venue where we can have those considerations play out is a good thing. So I'll take that on board. I haven't heard anyone express concern about adopting this. Okay. I'm going to jump down to key, I think, because client hints currently relies upon this spec. And once the tool server wakes up, we'll take a look at it. There it is. So this is a spec that Roy and I put together a while back and have sat on for quite some time. Basically, it's a way to specify, when we revised the HTTP caching in HTTPBIS, we defined this explicit concept of a secondary cache key. That the URI is the primary cache key, and the secondary cache key is whatever request headers that Vary selects. So it's the result of applying Vary. The problem is that Vary is very coarse-grained, and so it's difficult. I'm going to try not to use the word Vary too much. It's difficult to select a useful secondary cache key just using Vary, because, for example, if there's a range of values and you want to select anything in that range, or if there's a substring you want to pull out and match for that, for example, if it's a user agent or a cookie, Vary doesn't give you that power. And so key is a way to specify more fine-grained secondary cache keys. And we attempted to do this by having all these modifiers specified to that secondary cache key to describe what the shape of it is. To be frank, I think last time I talked to Roy about this, we were both kind of ambivalent about it. It's either, you want to do this to give people this power, or you want to kill secondary cache keys altogether because they're so fraught with complication in implementation and specification. But talking to Ilya's very excited about this because of the capabilities it would give. He talks to other folks who he regularly pings us with and says these folks are interested in key as well. And so it does seem like there's a community that's interested in this capability. What do folks here think about that? Is this, if we wanted to adopt client hints to make it work with especially browser caches, we would need some facility like this to describe how to cache these things.
Stuart Cheshire, Apple. I don't know the details of this, but I will relay a message on behalf of the iTunes team that they would like to see something like this.
Okay. Tell them to come here. We'll see them in Prague. Oh, yes, that's true. Hi, guys. Pretty soon you'll take over. Anybody else?
Yeah, Martin Thompson, my concern with this, as it always has been, is simply the complexity of this. I think if you cut this down to something that addresses the use cases that you can actually identify, leaves a little bit of an open door for maybe something extra in the future.
Yeah.
Then I think that's good. But if guys at iTunes actually have some specific things they want, then we can cram it in there and do it that way. I'm sure that you can help us there.
Yeah, I will ask them to communicate their specific needs, because I agree with you. Building some overly ambitious thing makes the deployment less likely. Yeah. Building something focused that meets a specific need is much more sensible. Yeah.
Right. right now it's very kitchen sinky. And part of that is because a lot of the people who come with use cases want to either match on cookies or they want to match on user agents. And especially with a user agent, that means a lot of substring matching and stuff like that. Some of Ilya's use cases are, for example, if you look at the device pixel ratio, he wants to cache something in a bucket. If the device pixel ratio is between, 1 and 2, cache, it in that bucket. But if it's between 0 and 1, cache it in this bucket. And so that's, that needs more flexibility, unfortunately. One of the reasons I think why key is so complex is because what you're doing is you're describing the syntax, how to parse the syntax of an HTTP header field. And HTTP header fields have a very loose syntax, and I'm being extremely kind. And that leads me to the next discussion.
I was about to say that the ultimate conclusion of this is you download some JavaScript that tells you whether or not what you have in cache is good or not. Hang on, we have that, don't we? It's called a service worker, isn't it?
I have 50 amps over there. I'll use it on you, all right? Julian has a specification here, which we talked about briefly before. And it's a little bit of, you have to twist your head and think about it. There we go. The idea is that, the underlying data model for HTTP header fields is extremely loose. It's specified as basically a stream of octets, not even characters. And there's some conventions around, combining with commas, but that's also extremely loose. And so as a result, there's a wide variety of syntaxes for HTTP header fields out in the real world, for better or worse. And Julian's idea was that if you define a convention for header fields that bases the underlying data model upon JSON, which everyone loves these days, and then describe a way to serialize that into HTTP header fields, I think there are examples down here, that gives you something much more reasonable in terms of parsing and how to model the values of a header field. So for example, here he's showing how to do, the attachment, the content disposition header field as JSON, so what it would look like as a JSON header field value, which, that does not look like an HTTP header field value, but it is absolutely legal to put those bytes into an HTTP header field value. It won't break anything by the spec. And everyone knows how to parse JSON, so that's kind of nice. And the reason why I bring this up now is that if we had a way to specify a header like this, and the new headers that Ilya wants to define for client hints use this convention, then all of a sudden, reasoning about, how to select a key on those header field values becomes easier because you have a normal data model. One that's not nearly as loose as that of HTTP header fields today. So that's kind of interesting. I think the other interesting application of this spec, besides just tightening up header field values, new ones that choose to use it in general, is that, if one day we define another version of HTTP, which we're not talking about today, and we say, well, any header field that uses this convention, we can represent in a much more efficient fashion on the wire, which we did talk about in H2, but we declined to do. That gives us an interesting lever into that new format. But that's an off in the future kind of thing. So what do people think about this document? Is this crazy talk? Is this interesting?
Channeling Julian, he says it also addresses internationalization and field values.
That's true. Internationalization becomes much easier, despite all the work that Julian put into doing it for normal HTTP header fields, or the current ones. It's still pretty obscure.
It's really interesting, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do it. I mean, if we take a 5 or 10 year view, I think that we're going to move towards using JSON for everything. And I know people who said that they've heard that with XML and so on before. Well, I can give them reasons why JSON is a Unicode type format that we're converging on for this particular type of thing. I don't think that this is quite the time to convert HTTP over. And before we did that, I would like to unmangle HTTP. Because at the moment, the HTTP headers are a mess. You have protocol headers that have to do with routing, and you have content, metadata, and the two are munged together in a really horrible way. I'd like to separate those two out before changing syntaxes of anything.
That implies a new version of HTTP.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, and I take it that Julian's listening, so this is really a question for Julian if he manages to type it through, but this seems pretty foundational in terms of change. And my question is, how does he view this use? Is it to be transitioned to? And if so, what's the transition view? And
I think I can probably channel Julian. This is not intended to be retroactively applied to existing headers. It's intended that a new header, if I define a new HTTP header today, I can choose to adopt this convention.
Okay, thanks.
So channeling right fielding first, he says he doesn't see how mixing JSON in the description is going to help anyone. There are no JSON header fields. There are syntax lists, parameters, and strings, each of which can be fully described without ever mentioning JSON. Key is, it's not an opportunity to define HTTP/3. Julian says, it's not a change, it's a format for new header fields, and the motivation is that most people who define new fields mess things up royally.
Yes.
That's a good answer for me.
Yes. And I think that was the original value proposition, which I should have covered, is that defining a new HTTP header field is hard unless your first name happens to be Julian, and a few other people. It's not something we do very well.
When I wrote an HTTP server and client recently, I use a protocol compiler to do that. And I actually use the same backend, same schema for defining RFC 822 style headers as I do for JSON. So it is possible to move from the RFC 822 style to JSON, but JSON is a lot more powerful, so you can't move the other way so easily. Listening to what Julian is giving as the rationale for his proposal, I think would be better served by having a schema language for HTTP headers, as opposed to what we do today, which is EBNF. And the problem with EBNF is that EBNF is really powerful and allows you, like regular expressions, allows you to a lot of string to get yourself hung with.
I think the problem there is that by defining a scheming language, we would have to define an underlying meta model, and the underlying meta model for the current set of in-use HTTP headers is extremely variable.
I can show you the code on SourceForge. I only actually had to do about 3 different syntactic variants.
How many headers do you handle?
Oh, all of them.
That's an interesting assertion.
All the ones. I could take all the ones from the HTTP.
Oh, that's different though.
RFC. Oh, you mean including
there's a registry, and then there's ones that aren't registered.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, those, yeah.
Julian replies that Philip was confusing the message format with the field value format.
So obviously, I don't think we're ready to adopt this one. It does seem like it's an interesting area of discussion. And if folks have other ideas, maybe we should see some more drafts. Personally, I like the ideas behind this. I still look at the resulting syntax and kind of cringe a little bit. But I know why Julian's made the choices he's made, and I think that he has made a lot of sound choices here. So maybe I need to get over myself. Here's another one. This is what if one were to define an authentication, the authentication header, that we use now. Well, I guess it's www authenticate. This is what it would look like using this model.
Julian suggests that it could be an informative document.
Informational working group document saying if you want to create a new header field, this is one way you could do it, but not requiring folks to do it. Why the look, Martin?
So, Martin Thompson, the concern I have with that is if people start developing proposed standard extensions to HTTP that go off and do this, then they don't
downref.
have any, well, I could care less about downref, but they don't really have anything concrete to stand on. I think they probably need something a little more concrete than just, you may use JSON
Right.
And a signpost. So if we're going to do anything, we may as well just do it.
Make it standards track, but make it absolutely clear that this is not being retroactively applied, nor is it being required for new headers.
New header field.
If you opt into this, this is one thing you can opt into it.
Maybe even the document can describe the acceptable forms for the existing ones, the standard param format that we see in a lot of the newer header fields, where you just have one hash param as the definition of the header field. Just saying, here's the old option, here's, there are a bunch of things that don't conform to this, but, that's the nature of legacy. And here's a new option that gives you additional expressivity and whatever else.
Okay.
I'd be kind of down with that.
Peter Grice, Facebook. I think even if, any sort of description of the right kind of set of best practices for describing headers doesn't turn into any sort of official recommendation, there's a lot of value in getting it out to the community. All sorts of apps are defining their own internal headers and using them, and being able to do that without shooting yourself in the foot would be a huge boon, I think.
So when we did BIS, we did have a section in part 2, recommendations for creating new header fields, which talked about a lot of things and a little bit about syntax, but it didn't go into incredible depth there. Putting aside Julian's specific proposal here, I'd like to hum and see how much interest there is in defining a convention for people to use when defining new headers for syntax, if that's a useful thing to have out there. So I'll ask for hum who would be interested in embarking on such work, not necessarily this specific proposal, but something that might end up looking like this if we make a series of decisions, and then who is not interested in that or think it would be harmful. Make sense? Okay, so who would support or who is interested in embarking on such work? Okay, and I'll also do a don't know, by the way. And who is uninterested or think it would be harmful? Okay, and who doesn't know? Okay, so it seemed like there was a decent hum on interested, useful, nothing on harmful / uninterested, and a bit of don't know. So it's definitely an area for some consideration. That's interesting. Okay. Let's...
channeling Mike Bishop, who says he's channeling Rob Trace. This could encourage data smuggling in headers.
Isn't that already the case in a lot of the headers? Yeah. Yeah. I understand.
Yutaka speaking. About one comment to the current draft. So, showing the data model using the model of the current header is really helpful for understanding how it will be done, but also the confusing that someone may think the existing data might be encoded in the new way. It's a completely a wrong idea, but people may confuse about reading. So it may be explicitly written. This is just an example and not intended to change the syntax of existing header. It's just the clear notion of that is very important, I think.
I agree, yeah. I found it confusing that, for instance, the draft included an example for authenticate, even though that's not the intention. A casual reader or someone skimming it will get confused about that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and have to think about that and maybe some more discussion on the list. Let's jump to this one, which we've talked about in the past a bit before. It is Tim Bray's draft for a new status code to report legal obstacles, the 451 status code. And from my perspective, I was not terribly excited about this for a while because I don't think that it showed much promise of being actually adding value, having machine readable uses of the status code. But having talked to a number of folks, both on the server side who were interested in producing it, and on the client side who were interested in consuming it, doing things like spidering the web and crawling to find instances of censorship or of restricted content, it does seem like that could potentially be addressed. We talked about this on the list not too long ago, and we saw a fair amount of pushback from some folks who felt that the semantics weren't precise enough, I think, or that it wasn't appropriate to define such a status code because its semantic wasn't appropriate for some reason. So I'd like to have that discussion a little bit now and see how people in this room feel about it. I'm still kind of on the fence about it. I think it's potentially interesting. I can see how it could actually be used in the world, which is a nice thing. So to me personally, that barrier isn't nearly as important. But on the other hand, if it's going to become a big political issue in the working group where we have a contentious back and forth over a year about it, that's not a terribly interesting way to spend our time either.
This is Barry as a participant. I've been on record before as thinking that this was pointless. I'm going to drop that objection and just go with whatever everybody thinks. And I have, as an AD, I have refused to AD sponsor this before, and I'm going to drop that objection and just go with whatever the working group thinks. So just to put that in perspective. As a participant, I looked a little bit at the working group discussion on this, but didn't read everything. What were the arguments about insufficient semantic?
That's a good question. I'll try and summarize
those real quick. Because that's one objection I never had about it. I think it's pretty clear in that regard.
Let's go. Let me summarize it real quick, and meanwhile, Paul
Hoffman.
Yeah.
Tim every month or so puts up example of somebody actually using it being useful. So the no one could use it argument sort of falls off. And at the same time, the argument of the semantics aren't clear sort of falls off because some people believe they can hear it. The semantics are inherently impossible, but so are the semantics for about 2/3 of our headers. So the fact that Tim has picked up a topic where we know that the semantics will be impossible to be precise on because they'll change from location to location and what's illegal here or what is an obstacle there will differ, but those arguments, even though they are valid for the I wish it were true, it's true for all other things that we're doing, and so it has shown to be somewhat useful. Whether it's going to be super useful is a different question.
Right.
When I said I thought the semantics were clear, what I meant was that the argument with safe hint was that the two ends didn't agree on anything. This isn't a matter of two ends agreeing.
Right.
It's whenever the server makes a statement, and that seems pretty clear to me.
Right. So looking at what happened on the working group list, refreshing my mind briefly, it appears that most of the pushback was, and it was just a few people, but it was a fairly spirited discussion. Most people who were pushing back, and to be clear, other people were supporting it, but some people were saying, well, you could just use 403 for this and then put something in the body. I think probably the distinction we'd have to make is that 403 is I am forbidding you from doing this.
Correct.
Whereas 451 would be someone has told me I have to forbid you.
Yes. And that would be changing semantics of 403. So one of the things that I thought was good on the mailing list was someone pointed that out, was that you can just use 403, or someone else had another 4 that they suggested. That actually changes the semantics of something that people think that they do understand today.
Right.
Larry Messenger. I think I was one of the people who pushed back on this as that its purpose was, maybe in the meeting, that its purpose was kind of political theater rather than protocol. But I can't see pushing this to full standard from standards track. Why not just do it as informational?
So we require IETF review for HTTP status codes after BIS, which means it needs... Oh, that can still be IETF review. It goes through process. That's true. Thank you.
I think informational might be more appropriate. It's something that's already in use. It has a meaning. Use it if you want. It preserves the code.
So to be clear...
I'll do an AD interrupt on that. And I think if you're going to do this, standards track is what's appropriate.
Sure.
Because it is specifying what the server is going to say and what the client should interpret from that.
Sure.
In some way.
Just to be clear, the use cases that kind of changed my mind, or at least made me more amenable to this, was that several parties said we want to crawl the web and find censorship, and that is a protocol. That's taking semantics and doing something with them.
Yeah, Tohan Baker. I'm not too worried about the semantics being precisely defined, in that it strikes me that this status code is giving more information. It may not be giving absolute information, but when you see it, you're going to get more information than 404 not found or 403 or whatever. And when people have been coming to the mic, talking mostly in terms of the law, well, most of the cases that content is blocked, it's not actually criminal law, it's civil. And in many cases, it's not actually the law, it's the threat of being sued. And so I think that asking the question of, are you unable to show this content because of the law? Well, no, it's not the law that's stopping me. It's the fact that if I show it, then I'm going to be sued and I'm going to be out $500,000 in legal fees. Yes.
Does that qualify as legal demands?
I think that it does. I mean, so trying to get precise about the law changing in every place. I mean, it's not the law here that's the issue. It's the fact that the law has been brought in.
It's the effect of it.
Yeah.
Or the affect, perhaps. John.
John Peterson. I mean, in terms of giving maximal information to people that are trying to access content that they legally cannot at the moment, is this status code actually superior to giving them a 200 OK with a page that explains what's going on? I mean, to your spidering argument, I kind of understand, but what do you get in addition to status code? If all you get is the status code saying, you can't get this, I can imagine actually getting a different web page served to you, one that actually explains to you something more, like a chilling effect style page. More useful.
And a 4XX status code can still have a body.
Okay, so
and it will be displayed in the browser.
If you precisely that, then okay,
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. Speaking of chilling effects.
This is Wendy Seltzer here with my chilling effects hat. And I work with the Chilling Effects Project that documents legal demands and the takedowns that they occasion, and it could be very interesting to use this header in conjunction either with extensions that might suggest to clients a place to learn more about the demand. In cases where the demand is limited to a jurisdiction where the person doesn't happen to be, it could be interesting to them to circumvent the restrictions. So the opportunity to do a bit more automation of the cataloging reasons, connecting them up to transparency reporting sites, connecting them up to the company's own transparency reports, and giving data to things like the Internet Monitor could all be useful additions to the web.
Right. And just to be clear, if we were to take this on, I would consider defining header fields to be used with the status code to potentially be in scope as well, which I know we've talked about before. Chris.
One place where this may actually help, and I'm not sure if this is discussed, is explicit proxies that are trying to block things for legal content, where you're trying to do a connect through it, and we're not going to interpret any page results that come back because that would be in the origin of the page that you're originally going to. But if there's a 4XX status code, we're not going to again display the page, but we could present something to the user to sort of say the proxy blocked access to this content.
Right. And we've actually discussed the possibility of even, well, no, it's a good point actually, and we haven't talked about it yet here, which is having a mechanism to distinguish between the origin saying I'm under legal duress or what have you, and the network saying I have been caused to do this, because they're two different use cases, as you point out. And that might be a different header on the status code, or it might be two different status codes that are used as appropriate. I think last time I talked to Tim Bray, the author, we were kind of leaning towards two status codes.
So I haven't heard anybody say no.
No, I haven't either. Is it worth a hum, Barry? Ish?
I personally don't think we need hums on these sort of things. I think we need to call for objections. So I haven't heard anybody say no.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to stand up and say no?
And if so, why? Okay. That sounds like good information. So we've done this. Indicating character encoding and language for HTTP header field parameters. This is, if I remember correctly, yes, just a BIS of 5987, which Julian did, if I'm remembering correctly, as an independent submission quite some time ago. And so this would be adopting that and updating it so that it plays nicely with our shiny new HTTP specifications. I think that's pretty uncontroversial to do that. That's a background maintenance task more than anything, and it would he spent a lot of time aligning this document with the HTTP-BIS document so that it's, I think, almost ready to go. Any comment on that?
Julian says it was a working group spec.
Oh, well, that shows how bad my memory is. Okay. Or his. Probably mine, though. I'm probably thinking one of his other specs. Okay. Client-initiated content encoding. This is another one of Julian's specs. How are we doing on time? Okay. Very simply, to allow a client to know when it's okay to send a content-encoded request.
Actually, Julian says, or he may have confused that with
Yes!
RFC 6260.
It is not often I get one over on Julian. Suck it. All right. So CICE is the client allowing the client to use content encoding on requests. I think we've gone back and forth on how to do this. This particular draft that we're looking at now is using accept encoding in a response to indicate that you can use a content encoding in a future request. I think we've talked about some other techniques that might be used in concert with that, but that would be the core of the proposal. So I guess the question is, client implementers especially, if we were to define this, would you consider using it to do content encoding on the body of a request with a body? Is that an interesting use case for you? I think the browser use case, it's maybe not terribly interesting for you guys. I could imagine curl being interested in this, for example, for API stuff. I know, in a past life I did a lot of HTTP API stuff, and sometimes when you're shoving big requests around, it's nice to know that you can compress something.
Well, Julian thinks he addressed those issues that came up during the last meeting, hopefully.
Okay. My inclination with this one is that it's an incremental addition to HTTP that's optional to use, that doesn't conflict with current practice, and it fits in really well with the architecture of HTTP. It's filling out a corner that's empty. So I think there are some people who could benefit from it. So my kind of default with this one is it makes sense to adopt it. So I guess the question is, does anybody think that this is a bad idea, or is not a good use of our time? Can you get to the mic, Larry? Sorry.
Larry, Messenger, do we have any other response headers that affect future requests?
Allow.
And how long is that good for?
It is indeterminately scoped.
And what scope is it
Yes.
for? And
Scoping in HTTP headers is something I can talk about all day.
but it's response headers for the future requests.
Yes. Yes. But then on the future request where you use that information, you have to treat it like a hint. You have to be prepared to take the error response and resubmit your request.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, don't tempt me. I wrote a paper once. I never published it though. All right. I'm not hearing pushback against that one. Okay. That takes us to 2XX patch. This is one of my drafts, and again, this is kind of filling out a hole. We, a while back, had the patch method added to HTTP where you can send a partial, a patch to a server to have it applied to a resource. This is kind of the inverse, where the server can send the client a patch to patch something in the client's cache. So you can send a patch to patch something as long as you have an e-tag for it. Again, I think it's an esoteric use case. It could be useful in a couple of corners. Really useful in a couple of corners, but they're fairly esoteric. Any thoughts? Martin, you're making that face again. Is that the "this will be harmful" face, or I don't know how I'd use this face?
Yeah.
Martin Thompson, I can see how this could be useful in those very narrow use cases. And I also see how it could turn into something of an attractive nuisance for someone who actually has to build these APIs. Oh, why don't we use the patch thing rather than structuring their API in a somewhat more orthogonal fashion? So I don't care, basically.
Yeah. I'd be interested to see if HTTP APIs would use it, but the only way they're going to use it is if it's defined. So, bit of a catch-22. Any other thoughts? Okay.
Ray Fielding says yuck.
He says, yeah, it's a good idea? Or yeah?
Yuck.
Oh, yuck. Okay.
Martin Nilsson, Opera. We currently do this when we are running a compression proxy. So we do patching, but then we do patch across everything that is in the cache, not just the specific resource.
Gents, can you keep it down? Thanks.
Roy expands more. He says that this would effectively make all requests vary. V-A-R-Y.
I'll have to think about that. Okay. That's a good one. So how do you handle that? If you're already doing it, how do you handle if it makes all requests vary? Sorry? Okay.
Don't you have to tie it to the e-tag?
Yes.
All right.
You would have to. And it has to be a strong e-tag, of course. We talked about these two, origin cookies and first-party cookies, a meeting or two ago. I think it was in Honolulu. And I've since talked to a number of people kind of in the hallways about them. It seems like a number of folks are interested in them, but there seems to be agreement that they're somewhat limited just because of the way deployment will go, and that you can't rely upon them to give you any additional security because you can't rely on them being implemented in the particular client you're talking to. And so I guess people question the utility, except in the very long term, of defining these. And I think that's where we're at with them. Any other comment?
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, the problem here is that the extension model of cookies is such that you ignore these extra directives.
Right.
And if the purpose of the directive is to narrow the scope of applicability for the cookie, you haven't actually done that for all the clients that don't support the extension.
Right.
So if the extension model had been a little bit more robust in the first place, then perhaps this would have been perfectly fine, and we can do this. We discussed the potential for this to be used in the foreseeable future to merely optimize the number of bits on the wire.
Right. Right.
But actually, with something like HTTP2, I think you're probably making it worse, because now you have multiple sets of requests with different cookies in them going to the same connection, and header compression is now, you're working against header compression rather than just letting it run.
Right. And people, it will become an attractive nuisance because people will skim it, assume that they'll get security properties from it that it doesn't give. Yeah.
This is Dr. Liu. My affiliation is Alibaba Group. So I think the first part, cookie draft, is very interesting. You can partly solve the cross-site request forgery attack. So I have some offline discussion with Arthur Mike, and I think I will continue discuss with him, and maybe I can contribute to this draft.
Okay.
Yeah, so Martin, again, there was a second series of points on this one, and one of these is if you perceive these as a defense in depth for something similar to the CSP things that people are doing, you send these out and compliant user agents can apply them and gain some added level of protection against things like cross-site request forgery and various other attacks. So I'm not completely against the idea. I think we just have to prioritize it against some other things.
Yes. I think maybe what might be interesting is to have a chat with the WebAppSec working group in the W3C, where Mike is very active, and get their input on it. Since since WebSec is closing down here, it seems like WebAppSec is becoming the locus for a lot of those discussions, and so maybe we should chat with them a bit more.
Channeling Roy again, he wants to make another comment about 2NN. Says actually it wouldn't require vary, it would just impact intermediates, which would not be able to cache what would have been a 200. So it ends up being like a 206.
Yes. It actually is very 206-ish in that sense. That's a good point. Yeah. And that alone makes me a little bit nervous because partial content has so many special cases around it, it's not funny. Okay, so these ones definitely need a bit more discussion, I think, before we consider adopting them, but I do detect some interest there. Next one up is one which we'll briefly mention because it touches heavily on security, and I think we need to have some buy-in from the security community before we even consider adopting it. Martin and I, mostly Martin, have been working on an encrypted content encoding for HTTP. So it basically using the content encoding layer in the HTTP stack as a way to shim in and say that this content is encrypted. Martin, do you want to give the kind of 2-minute spiel maybe, or?
Yeah, so this is something that's come up in a couple of use cases. One of the things we're doing in Web Push is we need the ability to send an HTTP message to a server that we don't actually want to trust with the contents of it. And so this would allow us to encrypt a message that server couldn't see, and then pass keying material by another channel, and thereby the recipient can decrypt the message, but not this intermediary, which is kind of interesting. I've had people talk about using file storage APIs where you push something up to a server, it's encrypted, the server doesn't get to see the contents, but you can share keys around between various authorized parties, and then they can download the document and they can reference their key stores and decrypt it and that sort of thing. There's also some really crazy caching stuff I've been sort of sketching out that may rely on something like this as well. And so this is basically just a very simple cut down version of essentially the TLS record layer with a little bit of variant key management on top of it to ensure that all the various security primitives are maintained across that. Read the draft. I'm having discussions with people this week about it. If you have comments or feedback, let me know. There's implementations and all of that. Pretty interested in getting something like this going. This seems pretty useful. We could have used things like Jose or CMS or any number of things, but none of those actually fit particularly well with HTTP semantics, particularly the requirement for HTTP that the body of a message be processed in a continuous fashion as opposed to a single blob,
right.
Particularly for large files. And there were a couple of other key management things that where this might vary from some of those other formats.
Right.
And I think trying to invent a whole lot of things. Oh, and the other thing is, this is AES GCM128 is the name of it. There is no optionality whatsoever in the format. I think the only option you get is how big the individual block, the records are in the streaming format. There's no other optionality at all, and that fits much better with the content encoding negotiation that we already have. Don't have multiple layers of negotiation with articulation at various points. Turns out that the animal falls over when you give it 15 knees.
And you're going to go and engage with the security community, like at SAG, about this?
Job,
yeah, okay.
Larry Messenger. On Monday at the Apps Area Working Group, I heard a presentation about wanting to also encrypt message headers as well as the message body. And are there any HTTP headers of the response that you would also want to encrypt and include them in the package?
Right. So the draft currently says that if you want privacy or any security features on the headers, you encapsulate your message in application/HTTP and put it inside the payload.
Paul Hoffman, wearing my old S-MINE working group chair hat. I would love to see a short enumeration of why CMS won't work, especially doing CMS with AES GCM. It may be that you're misunderstanding it. It may be that we were all misunderstanding, because we certainly intended, as one of the things when we were doing S-MINE 3, to be able to use this for things like this in the future. And the S-MINE mailing list sort of it's not active, but there's still enough S-MINE people on it where if you could send that to the list, people might go, oops, we missed it. Or, nope, you're wrong. Hopefully they're correct when they say you're wrong, not just being security geeks. And that might work out better for you.
Okay. So that one's, I think, at this point more of just an FYI. And finally, then we have a repo where we've been collecting a few issues against the HTTP 11 BIS documents. Excuse me. And talking to Julian, I think the intent has always been to eventually take HTTP 1.1 to full standard. It's a bit silly that it isn't a full standard. Originally, HTTP BIS, we were talking about going to full standard, but then we got towards the end and found that the changes to the documents were just too substantial to take it directly to full standard. And we've talked about, once HTTP 2 was done, we'd take a look at a pass over the HTTP 1.1 documents and adjust them to align better architecturally with HTTP 2 so that, there was a proper segmentation so that it made more sense. Right now there's a lot of stuff mashed into part 1. And so this is one of those things that we've had on the back burner for a while. Now that HTTP 2 is done, we may want to consider bringing this to the front burner. It may be that we want to sit on them for a bit longer and collect errata and collect a little more experience with H2 to figure out how it's going to fit into things. But it's definitely something that's on the eventual horizon. Julian, did you have any other any thoughts about that? We haven't talked about it in a little while. Is he typing? It's kind of late in Germany, isn't it? Okay. All right, well, maybe he'll get back to us in a minute. I can't see us starting this right now. If we're still here as a working group in something like 6 months, I could see us maybe embarking upon this.
He said he agrees, no further thoughts.
No, yeah, it's just kind of something that we eventually have to do. Yeah. Okay. All right. How are we doing on time? Not too bad. So what we've got left then, one of the things that has been talked about on the list a bit and in the meetings is, giving people advice on how to deploy HTTP2 now that we have the protocol out and standardized. We have a FAQ on the working group homepage, or rather on the H2 homepage, but the deployment advice there is remarkably thin. And Larry's been bringing this up from time to time and saying that, I think the collective wisdom is that you can deploy H2 and get a noticeable performance benefit, somewhere between 5 and 15%. But to get the full benefit of the protocol, you need to do some tweaks. And those tweaks can be anything from, changing inlining and sharding and all those techniques that people, hacked into H1, as well as tweaking how you use TCP and how you use TLS, and how you think about, connection termination, timeouts, load balancing, stuff like that. And it would be useful in terms of helping adoption of the protocol if we had somewhere to write that down. Additionally, over the life of the work, people occasionally have said, oh, well, if we do it like this, you could pull this cool trick and get this performance benefit or this other benefit. And if we could collect some of those cool tricks to give the open source, especially implementations, a bit of an idea of how they can utilize this new protocol, it would again help the community and help identify areas of interest for more experimentation and more knowledge. And so I think we should talk about, do we want to try and collect that information while we still have at least some of the implementers in the room, and what the appropriate way to put that information together is. Larry.
I've had some good conversations this week, and I think that there's two separate topics that are related. But the first one is really just how do you measure HTTP performance? What does it mean to be measurably faster? How do you benchmark HTTP not just in your lab, but in the real internet? And if you want to put up a server and you have users in low bandwidth or high latency, or they're over satellite links or whatever, it's someone who wants to just decide whether or not a deployment is better or worse. How do they measure it? What are the measurements, and what are the results? And then secondly, deployment advice to improve that. But just getting clear on how you're measuring performance might be something that you don't need to wait on, because it helps you set your goals for HTTP3 or tweaks or whatever, and also that lets you evaluate deployment advice of whether or not the advice that someone suggests works for me will work for you as well.
Right. So to the first point about measurement, luckily, the W3C has a web performance working group, and they have a lot of depth in that area, and have spent a lot of time working on it and defining the browser APIs for what people colloquially call real user management, or RUM. And so we could certainly engage with them to make sure that, and we've talked to them previously about measuring H2. I would think that the most natural place for that to be discussed would be over there, perhaps in liaison with us.
So let me get back to that. There are lots of people at the IETF whose job is trying to measure TCP performance, IP performance around the internet, and getting their involvement, I think, is really important. I don't know how well the liaison is going to work when it's in W3C.
Well,
and that's the source of my concern, that really getting the attention of the of the lower layer performance community that HTTP performance depends on some of the characteristics that they might not be aware of.
I certainly see how their experience could be brought to bear, but measuring web performance is a fundamentally different thing. And I don't see a lot of those folks coming here. I could be wrong about that. Web performance is much more about, the operation of the browser on, assuming we're talking about web pages here, and what people think of, we could have a synthetic benchmark for HTTP performance for a file download, but that doesn't really relate to the reality of what most people use HTTP for. And that's why RUM is much more interesting in that sense, because it is measuring what the end user perceived performance is. And that's the goal that most people are interested in. It's directly measuring how long does it take to paginate this particular collection of content under a variety of network conditions and real world network conditions. And especially when we talk about the web, as I'm sure, latency and is very important. Bandwidth is somewhat important. And the variety of networks it's deployed upon has a lot to do with what performance means. And that's why they come to mind first for me, because that's what they live and breathe in that community. And frankly, I think a lot of the knowledge about HTTP performance, HTTP2 performance, is also going to come from that community over time, because those are the people who did it for HTTP1. Paul.
Paul Hoffman. Two things. One is we do actually have a working group in the IETF, the benchmarking working group. I would not recommend this go there. They often get very, very blocked on anything that is beyond one interface talking to another with various things. And sometimes it can take them literally 5 years to do a spec. So I don't think that that's the time frame we were talking about. But the other is that remember that there are also manufacturers of test equipment who try to come up with metrics on their own on these things. And specifically, I've been talking to some recently about web performance, and they make up numbers just as fast as we do. So having something like RUM, where it really is people who are familiar with the kinds of things that make the numbers you get surprising. Getting predictable numbers saying, oh, when I do this, it'll be exactly 10 milliseconds. That's not what we want, because that's not, the topic we're talking about is deployment advice. You don't want deployment advice that says, this is how you're going to get a typical result. You want deployment advice that says, in a slightly atypical environment, what should you have chosen? And so even the Spirents and the Ixias of the world will be able to give you numbers and will be able to say, this is how we measure things. But if you push them even just a little bit, they will admit, no, this isn't about real world. This is about being able to test very high, numbers on a known good system. Right. So I think RUM's actually the better place to do this.
Right. I think often the focus of that work is how many packets or whatever's per second can a particular device handle. Yeah.
Dan Druta, I'm going to try to answer your second part of your question. How should this be structured in terms of advice? And I think we have to dissect it in two different ways, goal-based and stakeholder-based. On one hand, I think goal-based kind of touches on what do you want to accomplish, what do you want to improve. You want faster load, do you want lower latency, do you want reduced bandwidth, all these things kind of trigger different conditions and recommendations. Second, stakeholder-based is basically, hey, this is for web developers, this is what you should do in your web application. As a webmaster, this is what you should be configuring at your web server layer. Service provider, whatever it could be an advice on a particular area of expertise, I think it will help tremendously. So I think we got to tackle both dimensions. Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense to me, yeah. For me, I guess the question in my mind is, we have a FAQ, we have a wiki. It was populated, when we were coming up with the protocol with the common questions about what is HTTP2 and why are we doing it and how does it work and things. But we haven't gone to that next step and collected these ideas and this wisdom and this experience into something that the rest of the world can use. So how do we effectively collect that information and source it and get it in a format that people can use? If it's just a matter of everybody saying, yeah, let's go and contribute to the wiki, if people follow you through, that's great. If we need a draft and have to talk about a draft and put a little more heft behind it, if that works, we can do that as well. But I'm looking for folks who are willing to contribute to such an effort and to get involved and put a little bit of time into it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. If we had a call, I guess, to contribute to the wiki to start and to write down some of the deployment experience and ideas, who would contribute? Would folks in the room here be interested in that? Okay. I guess, so Larry, to your question, it's, I can't force people to work, unfortunately. I haven't yet been given that whip. Is Yari still in the room? Maybe he needs to give me some special power. I think that the web performance community over time will build this documentation and this body of knowledge. I would love to have it come from this community, and I'll talk to some people on the side and try and give people incentives and do what I can to write down what I know. But at the end of the day, if people don't step forward, there's not a lot more we can do. Okay. So, finally, we've had a couple of discussions on the side about other uses of HTTP2 or specific application profiles of HTTP2. And one of those is MPEG-. Are people familiar with MPEG-? It's basically doing video streaming over HTTP. And they saw HTTP2 as an opportunity to do some interesting stuff. So as soon as I find it, there it is. Hervé, you want to go ahead and do your presentation? Yeah, great. I don't think the microphone up there is working unless something drastic has changed.
So,
yeah.
Can you see the slide or I'm...
The remote people can't see you, but that's just how it's going to have to go. Yeah.
Okay. So I will be bringing you what is being discussed currently in Dash. So next slide, please. So Dash is about streaming video over HTTP, video and audio, so media. The Dash format defines two things: a media description and a media segment format. And so the media description contains all the data necessary for a client to play the media by downloading the media segments. The media is split into segments, and the client downloads them to play it on the client side. Dash provides adaptation, so for a given media, you can have segments at the different resolutions or different quality, so that the client can adapt it to the network between the server and itself. Currently, there is a core experiment that is a sub-working group inside Dash that is working on full duplex HTTP-based protocols. They are interested in both HTTP2 and WebSocket. And for HTTP2, they are very interested in server push. And this discussion has been ongoing for several meetings, and they have wrote a first draft during the last MPEG meeting in February. Next slide, please. So their goal is to reduce streaming latency, but there is a trade-off to do using Dash currently. If you want to have a low latency, you need to have short segments, but this means many requests because you have to every a few seconds or even with short intervals, you have to request the next segment. And so they would like to have the best of the both worlds, very short segments to have a low latency, but not many requests. So the idea is to use HTTP2 push to be able to require one segment, but have the server push several segments. And one thing that is very important in Dash is that the client controls everything. So when the client requests one segment, it also indicates to the server what it would like the server to push. So next slide, please. So what is being defined currently is a new header, HTTP header, called dash push. And this is an indication of what the server, what the client would like the server to push. And currently there is two ways of using it defined in the specification. The first is to ask the server to push the next K segments. So in the example, dash push the next segment, K equal 5. So the server will respond to the request by sending as a response the requested segment, and in parallel push the next 5 segments. Another possibility related to this is to ask the server to push segments corresponding to a duration. So key seconds of duration, for example, 10 seconds of durations, and the server just push enough segments to have to cover a 10-second duration. So next slide, please. There are possible extensions to this because currently this is really Dash specific, and there are proposals for extending this, supported by Canon. A first possibility is to use a URI list. So instead of saying, I want the next K segment to be pushed, I give the list of the URIs of the next segment. This can be somewhat verbose because the segments may have long names and possibly repeating names because if there are many segments, they will have the same name structure with just a number differing in this. So instead of a URI list, we could use a URI template. Inside this template, we have a variable in curly braces, and the values of these variables are defined at the end of the header. So in the first example, the variable number 1 takes the values 1, then 2, then 3. To make things shorter, we can use a range of variables. This is the second example. And it's also possible to have several variables. In the third example, we have a first variable for the quality or the level of the representation, which takes two values, R1 and R2. And a second variable that takes a range of value from 1 to 3. We could also use URI wildcards. So, for example, here I ask the server to push all the text/CSS files related to the file I'm requesting. This can be really powerful and send more things that I'm expecting, or the client is expecting. And next slide, please. And this is not only limited to URI, but we could use it also for other header values. And one example is when requesting a range, we could ask the server to push other range of the same file. And so here it's just a list of values for the header, but it could be extended to support templates also. And next slide. So as a conclusion, the current design in the FDH specification is really Dash specific. And so our first question is there interest for making this less Dash specific, so more generic? And is there interest in this room for working on this, and taking this for having something more generic? And also, do we have any recommendation or feedback to give the Dash working group?
Dan Drutza. I have a question for clarification. If you go back to those options, Dash, as I understand, the benefit of the adaptive part of it is that you will switch the encoding and you'll use different URIs. And technically, if you're pushing too much and the conditions change, then you're not able to signal to the server that you actually want something else. So the number doesn't work unless you actually have the ability to push a request for a different kind of encoding. URIs definitely don't work if you submit too many URIs and they will start being pushed. So I don't know if this was considered, but it is an issue that has to be considered in the case of push. How quickly can you adapt?
Well, it's a trade-off. Okay. Either you do many requests and you can adapt any time, or you use push. You ask the server to push some URIs or some segments, and it's more difficult to adapt. Anyway, you will have it's always tricky to adapt quickly because you will have to request segment in advance, and you probably have a few pending requests, and if you see the network dropping, it's difficult to adapt. You can kill the request and make other requests, but.
So Darshak Thakur, Cable Labs. So let me first ask the clarifying question. So when the server sends this, or the client sends dash push, it is expected that the server will send push promises for these guys, right, before sending the stream. So if the client wants to cancel something or change the adaptation set, it can send a reset stream on some of the push promise, right? And that's how it can change it. Okay, so that's okay. So now, given that, I think I see the value in the dash push specifically from the point of view of the client requesting. And just to add a comment, I think it might be useful for something outside of Dash, like where the client is probably requesting even a Retina image or some, additional higher quality image or something like that. That might be one use case. So that's kind of where I see the benefit. What I don't really see the advantage of is the URI template or the wildcard. It seems to be adding a lot of complexity without adding any real value except a few bytes that you are saving. That's and I didn't understand the range option at all completely, or why it would even be used.
Okay. I'm channeling several people here. Both Julian and Roy say a request to push really sounds like a GET. And how is this better than pipelined GET requests or multiple requests in H2? I've got another channel.
Yeah. Well, we could expect server to be able to better coordinate all the sending all the segments if they receive all the requests or the pseudo requests at one time.
So let me try try and make it a little more succinct. HTTP2 is designed so that you can interleave a number of requests together with very low overhead. So server push is designed for cases where the server knows the client should be getting something, but the client doesn't know it. But here you're having the client hint the server to send something that the client doesn't know. And I think that's maybe the cause of the conflict, in that, if you can serialize, 20 gets or whatever in one packet, which is completely possible in HTTP2, then the benefit of this is, I guess, a little questionable. I think that's what they're trying to say.
Okay. Craig Taylor says, I have concerns over how push affects the ABR semantics also. As I understand it, server push will drop the asset in the browser cache, and client heuristics may be blind to this. Martin and others should confirm.
Yes, there is a problem currently with existing APIs. The client doesn't know if there was any push. Something I didn't put here is that there is an intent to add some acknowledgement from the server, probably in the form of a specific header. So in the response to the initial GET request, the server would send an acknowledgement it received this -push header and will process it. So then the client, seeing the header, the client knows that it can retrieve the segment directly from its cache.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I had the same sort of thought as Roy and Julian here. I mean, if you know what you need, then just ask for it. The thing that I thought push had an advantage with over the existing mechanisms here for something like Dash was situations where the server knew more than the client about the things like, say, the pacing of these segments. So if there was a situation where, for instance, you started to watch a video and you got the first chunk down, and then at some period of time, just ahead of the point that you might start downloading the next segment, the server simply sent it to you without you asking, then that actually has advantages, but that changes the emphasis to the server side of things. And you can imagine that the adaptive thing would simply manifest as the client recognizing that the network has changed and requesting a different type of segment, so it asks for the lower quality one when it notices the bandwidth go down. And the server could make the same sort of observations and also drop down. You have some coordination conflicts there that you have to resolve, but otherwise, I'm kind of confused about how this works, because if the server knows the structure of the stream that's coming out there, then it can just simply send the stream. And that's where I thought you'd be heading with this one, whereas this just looks like multi-get, and I think we kind of stomped on that last time that someone suggested it.
Okay, so as I'm involved in this MPEG Dash activity, so just to answer the previous question, I think yes, the server might know more than the client. It has the manifest file. In Dash we call it the MPD, and so it might know what, for instance, the URLs of the future segments are, or maybe there is an update to the manifest that the client doesn't know about. So it pushes the MPD update to the client. And now one question we had actually in MPEG Dash, which was not clear to us, is whether the HTTP stack exposes the cancel operation. So the client might want to do an adaptation. Let's say it asks for pushing a particular representation, and then 10 seconds in the future it says, okay, I need to adapt. So I need to cancel the previous request, the push request, and switch to a different representation. And it was not obvious, at least the stacks we have looked at, they did not expose this cancel operation to the application. So in WebSockets we define the cancel operation, but in HTTP2 we don't have that. So I think that's something where we would need guidance on here, and that's why I think one way is to say push case segments and then wait basically for the case segments, but that's not acceptable in several situations. So we need a clear solution for that. We don't also want to tear down the TCP connection. That's exactly what we are trying to avoid here by using the push in HTTP2. The other thing is whether the push strategy is going to be defined somewhere. So in Dash we have particular timing model. So you cannot you push segments when they become available if it's a live stream. If it's on demand, maybe all segments are already available. So when to push what, and then there are lots of implications on flow control and so on. So I think those are open questions we have in MPEG Dash.
So just to respond to that briefly, HTTP2 doesn't really specify how push is to be surfaced to the client. It does suggest that it is taking effect on the cache in the client. That it's effectively a cache update. So there's not necessarily an API where you get an event from push. And while some people are using or perhaps abusing server push to be like an eventing mechanism, it was primarily just the concept was pushing something into the cache. I've personally wondered about whether we should define a web API, browser API to notify a listener about cache updates and thereby making that available, but that's future work. Just so folks know, we've got 7 minutes left, and I see there's still a substantial queue there, so try and speed it up a bit.
This is Patrick. So also, the comment about this looks a lot like a request for a GET. But one of the things you lose by not doing that hasn't been pointed out is the explicit ability to prioritize these, or at least prioritize these things without a round trip. And not just in weights, in terms of dependencies, which seems like actually the use case that the dependencies were invented for in H2, that you want to basically put the chunks of the stream in order. And maybe that's an overlaid concept on what you have here and it's just implied, but there might be alternative ways you want to do that, and by just making this a series of pipeline gets, you preserve that flexibility, which I think is good. When I saw the title to this, I actually expected it to be more like what Mark was talking about, where perhaps you would have a stream to get the MPD open, and then you of course would get the MPD, but also on that you might have pushed performance events or something like that, which would be interesting, additional metadata streams down into the client. So Firefox does have an extension API for pushes directly to content if they want it to be privileged content. I think I saw Chrome did the same thing, and they probably don't match. And that, I agree, would be a really nice thing for standardization. That you could see how this could be actually an interesting use case around getting metadata on the entire Dash experience, where each individual stream was still just an adaptive chunk of video.
Larry Messenger. I just wanted, maybe people don't understand the implicit context that MPEG-Dash is used for using HTTP for real time. That each segment of a movie is served over HTTP, and there's a big difference between telling the server, if you can have it ready in time and I'll get it in time, then push it, and otherwise forget it, because I'll get the next segment. If you have a series of pipeline gets, you're going to get all of those segments, whether or not it's too late for them. This is implicitly, the timing of it is implicit. Both sides know how long each chunk is, and how long they expect it to be delivered. And so it's not the use case where you would even ask the question about pipelining gets versus asking push, because the timing is just implicit. If you wanted to generalize this, you might want to make the timing more explicit, that each thing in your series, you expect it 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds later, and if it's not available, just skip it.
Chicago Cable Labs. So I'm not sure when you mentioned real time, I'm not sure if Dash is actually used for real time. It's mainly still a progressive download. But having said that, so the one, I guess I just came here to comment about The one place where the server might have more information about pushing segments down compared to the client is when you're streaming live content. The MPEG Dash has a mode of live, where the segments are actually not always there on the server, and the server is the only one that knows when those segments are going to be available or being generated. So that's where the server may have a little bit more intelligence in pushing.
So Martin Thompson, there was a comment earlier in the line about not being able to cancel an ongoing request when something changes. It actually makes that worse. But that's a fair comment. The protocol, HTTP2 does have the ability to cancel an outstanding request, no matter where it's at.
Right.
It could be at any point. The problem is that none of the APIs expose that, as far as I can tell. I'm looking at fetch here, which is what people are putting the effort into, and that has no mechanism by which we can say, hey, just give up on this one, cancel the underlying stream, give up on it. And I think that actually has some valid use cases for it. You can abort XHR? Yeah.
I think we have an action item to go and engage with Anna and make sure that fetch is fine-grained enough for H2. I think that's a very useful thing to do. Yeah. Okay. Was that all you had?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a good outcome of this at the least. I don't hear interest in making this a generic extension yet here. I think if you guys decide to do this, I personally would give some feedback. I noticed that the syntax here, you have an unprotected URI and you need to put quotes around that, which to me is an argument for using the JSON-based format that Julian's come up with. It's a great illustration of how hard it is to come up with an HTTP header. While we're talking about Dash, and since we have 2 minutes left, I've had a separate private conversation with some Dash folks who have a use case. They want to be able to communicate to a client that they have partial content or sparse content to send back. So the client asks for a segment, and the server, for whatever reason, intermittent connectivity upstream, only has a partial segment to send. But they want to be able to send that partial segment back to the client if the client can make use of that. And they were attempting to shove that into partial content, into range, which I kind of steered them away from because I felt like any intermediaries in the path would do very surprising things to it. And so right now I'm steering them towards a media type that allows them to, basically a sparse media type. They're thinking about just reusing the multi-part content range, multiple ranges type to do that, which, that's a choice. But if people are interested in that or have comments about that, talk to me and I'll loop them into the discussion. It's another interesting side discussion. But generally on this topic of new work or things we might do next, it sounds like, if I can get rid of this, it sounds like Barry and I have to do some chatting about some of them, and some of them need some more discussion in the working group, and some of them we probably won't talk about anytime terribly soon. So expect to hear some more about those relatively soon. Thanks, everybody. We're just about out of time.
I had a question about new work. So I didn't put it on that existing yet, but so I'm also kind of involved in code and some of the code name formatting, the code, defining code name formatting the code working group.
Which one for it?
Core.
Oh, core. Okay, yeah.
So, and we are also trying to use that in other organizations. So the web linking IETF92-HTTPBIS-20150324-1300 has kind of evolved or been used in a lot of places, especially because JSON and serialization, Do you think it might be worthwhile to kind of take a fresh look at this?
I have kind of a background task of 5988 I have a repo with an issues list.
Okay, great.
Do you have my email address?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, just m.at.net, or I'll give you a card. Yeah, I can point you at that, and if you have other issues, please raise them. Because I think eventually I do want, that's not mine, hold on. I do want to do that.
Okay, and that's one of the things we are, I'm actually working in a couple of other organizations around IoT.
Okay.
There's a lot of interest there, so
sure.
we might be actually able to do any
okay.
work that
yeah.
needs to be